Welcome back to The Heat. South Korea has strongly denounced this month's failed attempt by the Democratic People's Republic of Korea to launch a mid-range missile. Seoul says it's a clear violation of UN Security Council resolutions and poses a threat to peace and security on the Korean peninsula. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea said the sanctions targeting the country's nuclear and missile tests are, quote, criminal documents. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Eunjung, what is the bottom line for South Korea here when it comes to negotiations with the DPRK concerning its nuclear program? Is the South Korean position that they have to get rid of all their weapons?
Again, if we recall our previous, the earlier discussions, of course, in some senses, again, I do agree with Zhao Tong's the observation as well. They might not, or absolutely, they will not actually abandon whatever they already got. That's pretty understandable too. That might be their own rational choice, but again, don't have very dangerous stuff within our territory or in the peninsula. So of course, in the international community, they all have membership, but still constitutional people feel who can represent all Korean people. The point is, again, as long as they behave like that way, again, the level of our patience cannot just, be that sustainable. And which means if we want to really resume the negotiations with North Korea, I do think at least the United States, South Korea, and China, we really need to have a deep pre-consultation before actually we invite the North Korea to the table. And these three countries, collaboration or cooperation or deeper communication among these three countries should be done fast, I think. Before we see whatever those bilateral dialogues or that excludes South Korea. So that might be, I think, kind of major concern of these days. The South Korean people. What if we are excluded from the table? Because we are, again, representing the whole Korean people.
Right.
So,
Okay, Brian, there's been some very tough talk from the South Koreans. Let's listen to what President Park Geun-hye had to say. Watch this.
As long as you own the rights to this country, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea will never be able to invade our country. Even then, if the DPRK provokes us, we shall let them know the price they must pay for provoking us by punishing them swiftly and strongly.
So very tough talk then. I'm wondering, at what point will South Korea resort to military action? Will it act in response to an attack, or will it take the first step and launch a preemptive strike?
I think it's largely for domestic political and public consumption in South Korea. I think the current government is a conservative government. They're trying to play to a nationalist orientation. I don't think there's going to be an attack by North Korea on South Korea, not a major attack. The North Koreans know if there's a major war again, it will be the destruction of North Korea. They're not about to commit suicide. Their whole goal is to survive, not to be dead, not to have the regime toppled. I think that's what the current South Korean government is saying is for politics. It's for domestic consumption. Again, I want to go back to where we were 16 years ago, because there was a different climate in South Korea at the time. The Kim Dae-jung government, the Sunshine Policy, reaching out to North Korea reciprocating, the Clinton administration in Washington giving a green light to all of that and sending Madeleine Albright to Pyongyang for talks. There was a sense of euphoria or semi-euphoria in North and South Korea. I was in North and South Korea at the time. Many Koreans could not believe it, possibly the end of the tensions, possibly a reduction in the tension. What made that possible? Two things: a liberal government in South Korea, a government that was willing to have rapprochement with the North, and a government in Washington that said, look, the old policy needs to be reversed. Now, President Obama changed the policy with Cuba. It was 54 years where there were no embassy, no normalization, no diplomatic relations. Now they've changed it. Did the world come to an end? Did the sky fall? No. Obviously, the U.S. and Cuba can be neighbors. They can be friends. I believe that what North Korea really desperately wants is a sense of security and a sense of acceptance by the United States as a legitimate entity. In other words, not to be the subject of endless regime change targeting either by massive simulated war games or other economic sanctions or covert operations. The North Koreans, like all other governments, can be dealt with. In other words, the United States government its policy needs to shift. And if it does, I believe there will be a very strong reciprocal message by other means, by DPRK, showing, yes, we're ready to talk. I don't think they will give up nuclear weapons, but I don't think that's, none of the nuclear powers, with the exception of South Africa, have ever given up nuclear weapons. But there are nuclear weapons in Russia, China, India, Pakistan, and many other countries, and the U.S. can have normal diplomatic relations with them. They can with the DPRK as well.
Zhao Tong, to get that assurance that Brian is talking about, that their security will not be threatened, would there have to be something like a rock-solid treaty between the international community and the DPRK to assure them that this policy wouldn't change from one president to another in the United States?
Well, I think on the American side, the continuation of policy is always a question. The U.S. Congress is very hesitant about signing any legally binding treaty, making significant commitment. I think there is serious domestic barrier here in the U.S. about signing a legally binding peace treaty with North Korea. With that said, I think still we need to work towards the ultimate goal of signing a peace treaty between all the warring parties in the Korean War, U.S. to Koreas, China, etc. With that said, again, the previous experience has told us that it's very difficult for North Korea to trust such political commitment, which can be walked back overnight. So maybe, again, let me play the devil's advocate here. Maybe let's now trying to really do away North Korea's recently gained sense of security by trying everything to dismantle its nuclear weapons. Maybe we can tacitly let North Korea hold on to its nuclear capabilities for a little while. In the meantime, let's try some near-term, more practical steps towards, firstly, freezing its nuclear capability, preventing it from further improving and increasing, and then convincing North Korea to show more transparency about the entire nuclear program, including the enrichment program, which we don't know very much about until now. And then during this process, if some confidence and trust can be gained between the two sides, that's the way we can explore some deeper and more radical steps, like trying to gradually reduce its nuclear stockpile step by step in an incremental way. I think that's the right way to go forward.
Okay. Eunjung, what about the deployment of this U.S. anti-missile system called THAAD? There's been a lot of opposition to it in the region from China. There's also been opposition from Russia to this program. How does that complicate efforts to find a solution?
Again, the major concern of these days, the South Koreans are our precedented or existing methodology might not be working to deal with this serious issue. But at the same time, of course, especially during the years of the Cold War period, of course, the nuclear umbrella provided by the United States was actually working very well. But at the time, back then, the North Korea didn't have this kind of capability, and we did have a kind of balance of power between the continental powers and the Pacific power. But now all these international circumstances changed, which actually discourages in many ways the South Korean people to keep supporting, again, the precedented or existing methodology. So that is why now more and more people are becoming serious about the military action or whatever those, military countermeasures. Again, that per se is not a panacea at all. We all know this. And we also worried about all this negative sentiments or kind of retaliation from the PRC. Of course, we are worried about that too. But at the same time, this is our survival issue, and we want to have a kind of, layered system that can deal with those real threats. That's,
Brian, final question here, and that is, much has been invested in the six-party talks in the past. The State Department here in Washington still thinks that that's the best way to resolve this crisis. Is that the best way in the absence of some major diplomatic move, like the next Secretary of State in the new administration going down to Pyongyang?
I think the six-party talks could be promising, but I don't believe they will work. I don't believe that China or Russia has the ability to subcontract out North Korean security. The North Koreans they're an independent government. They emphasize the issue of self-reliance. Also, Russia and China have divergent agendas with the United States. The United States is using North Korea, I believe, as a pretext to put THAAD into South Korea. THAAD doesn't really protect against North Korean missiles. It's high altitude. It's about outer space. It's about military supremacy in outer space. That's a direct threat towards China and Russia in terms of the long-term military contingency planning. So there's a divergence in interest. They all want to have a reduction of tension in the Korean Peninsula. That is what puts them together. That's what makes it possible and plausible. But I think ultimately the change in Korean Peninsula will come not from Moscow, not from Beijing, not even from Seoul or Pyongyang. It'll come from Washington, D.C., and whether Washington, D.C. is ready to do what the Clinton administration appeared to be ready to do in 2000, which is to normalize relations with DPRK.